She stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk, and she had never felt more invisible in her life. The chapel at Thornfield was filled with the rustle of noble guests, the scent of burning wax and old stone, and the low murmur of quiet judgment. Elara Vance kept her eyes on her folded hands, but she could feel their stares pressing into her back like cold fingers. The whispers had begun the moment she stepped through the doors. A baron's daughter fallen into poverty, sold into marriage like a piece of unwanted furniture. A transaction dressed up in flowers and ceremony. The Duke of Thornfield stood beside her, tall and unmoving, Alaric Ashworth. His presence filled the chapel like a drawn blade. Every line of him was rigid composure, from his cut of dark hair to the hard angle of his jaw. He did not look at her, not when she arrived at his side, not when the bishop began the vows, not when she spoke her quiet "I will." His gaze remained fixed somewhere just beyond her shoulder, as if she were a ghost he had agreed to tolerate. When the ceremony ended and he offered his arm, it felt like touching marble. She placed her fingers on his sleeve, and they walked down the aisle together without a single glance passing between them. The applause was polite and hollow, like rain on a window pane. That night, alone in her new chambers, Elara sat on the edge of a vast bed draped in velvet and shadow. The silence of Thornfield Hall was heavier than any noise she had ever known. Her husband had not come to her door. She had not expected him to. She unpinned her veil with trembling fingers, and a single tear rolled down her cheek before she could stop it. But she did not sob. She simply pressed her lips together, lifted her chin, and told herself that she would survive. She always had. The first weeks of her marriage passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Thornfield Hall was grand beyond measure, all echoing corridors and towering windows that looked out onto the windswept moor. The servants were respectful but distant, their eyes sliding away from her as if her unhappiness was something contagious. The Duke took his meals in his study or away from the estate on business. She dined alone at a table built for 20, the clink of her fork against porcelain the only sound in the room. She tried at first to reach him. She left fresh flowers in his study, little notes written in her careful hand. "I hope your day is peaceful. The heather on the moor is blooming today." She never received a reply. Once she gathered the courage to knock on his study door. He opened it, looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes, and said only, "Is there something you need?" The chill in his voice was so complete that she could only shake her head and retreat. After a month, the truth settled into her bones like winter frost. He did not hate her. That would require feeling something. He simply looked through her, as if the marriage contract had contained a clause that rendered her invisible. She was the Duchess of Thornfield in name. In reality, she was a ghost wandering a beautiful, empty house. The turning point came on a gray afternoon in early autumn. She was walking through the village that bordered the ducal lands, wrapped in a plain cloak, when she heard a child crying. The sound came from a cramped cottage near the edge of the lane. A young woman, barely more than a girl, was clutching a feverish infant to her chest, her face streaked with panic. "Please," the girl sobbed. "The physician won't come this far without payment. She's burning up." Before she could think, Elara was already pushing through the door. Her mother had been a skilled healer, famous in their small corner of the world before debts and sickness had taken her. Elara had learned at her side. The knowledge was still there, buried but alive, a secret gift she had never been allowed to use publicly. A noblewoman who practiced medicine was a scandal. A duchess would be a disgrace. But standing in that damp cottage, watching a baby struggle for breath, she did not hesitate. She sent the mother for cool water and crushed herbs, speaking in low, steady tones. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, mixing a poultice, sponging the tiny forehead, coaxing drops of medicine between parched lips. By nightfall, the fever broke. The baby's cries faded into a peaceful sleep, and the young mother fell to her knees in gratitude, clutching Elara's hands. "Bless you," she wept. "Bless you, miss. Who are you?" Elara hesitated. Then she smiled, a small, sad smile. "Just a friend." She returned to Thornfield Hall in the darkness, slipping through the servants' entrance with her hood pulled low. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. After that, it became her secret life. In the daylight, she was the invisible Duchess, sitting through stiff teas with visiting nobles who treated her like a curiosity, enduring the pointed slights of Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's widowed cousin, who had made it painfully clear that Alara was an intruder in the family. "You must find Thornfield rather overwhelming," Lady Beatrice had said during their first meeting, her smile as sharp as a paper cut. "Coming from such humble circumstances, I mean. I'm sure dear Alaric did what he felt was right for the estate. He is so very devoted to duty." Alara had simply inclined her head. "I am learning." "Of course you are." The older woman's gaze traveled over her gown with glacial precision. "How brave of you." By night, Alara became someone else entirely. She wore a simple gray dress and a coarse wool cloak, and she carried a leather satchel filled with dried herbs, tinctures, and clean bandages. She walked the rutted lanes to the outlying farms and the cramped village hovels, where the sick and the weary welcomed her with astonished relief. She set broken bones, soothed fevered brows, delivered babes, and held the hands of the dying. She never gave her true name. The villagers began to call her the Grey Lady, and they spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it was the first time in months that she felt like a real person. When she returned to her cold chambers at dawn, slipping off muddy boots and washing her hands in a basin of water, her heart was no longer hollow. It was full. For a time, she thought she could live this way forever, split between two worlds. But then the physician came, and everything began to shift. His name was Julian Hartley, a young doctor from the city who had been hired to tend to the Duke's tenants during a particularly harsh season of fever. He was kind-faced and earnest, with gentle hands and a quiet voice. He had heard rumors of the Grey Lady and had been skeptical, but one evening he was called to a farmhouse on the northern edge of the estate to find her already there, calmly stitching a wound on a farmer's arm, while the man's wife looked on with relief. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes wide. "You're real." Alara looked up, her face half hidden by her hood. For a moment she froze, but his expression was not one of accusation. It was awe. After that they began to cross paths more often. He did not ask who she was, sensing the boundary she had drawn. He simply fell into the habit of working alongside her, sharing supplies, discussing treatments in low voices while the moon climbed the sky. He was the first person who had looked at her, truly looked, in longer than she could remember, and it made something fragile tremble inside her chest. One night, as they walked back from a difficult birth that had ended safely, he said quietly, "You have a gift. The world should know about you." Alara shook her head, her gaze on the dark road. "The world would not understand." "I understand." His voice was soft. "I know you must have your reasons for hiding, but whoever you are in the daylight, I want you to know that the work you do here matters. You matter." She blinked rapidly, glad for the darkness that hid the sudden sting in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said such a thing that she had forgotten what it felt like. That was the night the Duke began to notice. Alaric Ashworth was not a man given to introspection. He had inherited his title young, shouldered the weight of a crumbling estate, and clawed it back to prosperity through sheer force of will. Emotions were a luxury he could not afford. When the opportunity had come to secure the Vance family's remaining lands through marriage, he had treated it like any other business transaction. The girl was quiet, graceful, and unassuming. She would not cause trouble. That was all he required. He had not expected the subtle ache that began to creep into his awareness over the passing months. It started small, the way her voice, soft and steady, echoed in his mind long after she had left a room. The way the house seemed to hold an unfamiliar emptiness when she was not in it. He found himself pausing outside the dining room door, listening for the sound of her footsteps. He never went in, but he noticed. Then came the changes. She stopped leaving flowers. The little notes disappeared. When he passed her in the hallway, she no longer hesitated as if hoping he might speak. She simply curtsied, murmured a polite greeting, and moved on. Her eyes, which had once held a flicker of something tentative and hopeful, had become calm and distant. It was as if she had built a wall of perfect courtesy around herself, and he was no longer permitted to cross it. At first, he told himself it was a relief. No more awkward encounters, no more silent appeals for affection he could not give. But relief soon curdled into something sharper. He began to notice her absences from the hall in the evenings. The servants reported that her ladyship often retired early, but one maid let slip that she had seen the Duchess returning to the house very late, her hem damp with dew. Curiosity, he told himself, nothing more. He had a right to know where his wife went at night. But the night he followed her changed everything. He waited in the shadow of the old oak tree at the edge of the garden, his greatcoat pulled tight against the chill. When she emerged from a side door in her plain gray cloak, his heart gave a strange, hard thump. She moved with a quiet confidence he had never seen in her before, her shoulders straight, her satchel slung over her arm. She did not look like the shy, invisible creature who had stood at his altar. She looked like a woman with a purpose. He followed at a distance, keeping to the hedgerows as she walked the dark lane toward the village. He watched her enter a cramped cottage, saw the warm glow of candlelight bloom in the window. Creeping closer, he peered through a gap in the shutters and felt the breath leave his body. She was kneeling beside a pallet, her hood thrown back, her hands moving with swift, sure grace over a sickly child. Her face was luminous with concentration, her voice a low, soothing murmur. An old woman sat nearby, wringing her hands, and Alara reached out to clasp those trembling fingers with a gentleness that made his throat tighten. The child's labored breathing eased under her care, and the old woman began to weep with thanks. Alaric stepped back from the window, his mind reeling. His wife, his silent, unremarkable wife, was a healer. She had been living a secret life of sacrifice and compassion while he sat in his study, walled off from the world. The realization struck him like a blow. He did not announce himself that night. He returned to the hall in a daze, his thoughts a storm of confusion and guilt and something else, something that felt dangerously like admiration. The following week he found himself manufacturing reasons to be near her. He joined her for breakfast, an event so unprecedented that the footman nearly dropped a tray. She looked up in quiet surprise but offered no comment, merely buttering her toast as if his presence were a minor weather pattern. He tried to speak, but the words felt clumsy. "The weather has turned cold," she nodded. "It has." And that was all. The distance she had built was so smooth, so seamless, that he could find no crack in it. Then Julian Hartley came to call. The young doctor arrived at Thornfield Hall on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in his neat but modest coat, and asked to speak with her grace. Alaric happened to be crossing the entrance hall when the butler admitted him, and he stopped short at the sight of the stranger's expression when Alara descended the staircase. It was a look of open warmth, of fond recognition, the kind of look that spoke of shared secrets and quiet intimacy. Jealousy slammed into Alaric like a wave of icy water. He had no right to feel it. He knew that. He had given her nothing, offered her nothing. He had been a stranger to her in all the ways that mattered. And yet, watching this earnest young man bow over her hand, watching the way her eyes softened with genuine pleasure at the sight of him, Alaric felt something crack open inside his chest. "Your Grace," Dr. Hartley said to Alara, his voice warm, "I wanted to thank you again for your assistance last night. The Miller boy would not have survived without you." Alara's gaze flicked briefly toward the Duke, a shadow of unease passing through her eyes. "You give me too much credit, Doctor. You did most of the work." Julian smiled, shaking his head. "I only provided the supplies. The knowledge was yours." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alaric felt his hands clench at his sides. He stepped forward before he could stop himself, his voice cutting through the foyer with a coldness that startled even him. "Dr. Hartley, a word if you please." The young man looked up, startled but composed. "Of course, Your Grace." Alara's eyes widened slightly. Alaric. He did not look at her. He led the doctor into his study and closed the door, his heart hammering with a fury he did not fully understand. But when he turned to face Julian Hartley, he found not fear in the young man's eyes, but a quiet, steady resolve. "Your Grace," Julian said before Alaric could speak, "I mean no disrespect, but if you are about to warn me away from the Duchess, I must tell you plainly that she deserves better than a warning delivered behind her back. She deserves to be seen, truly seen." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You have a treasure in your home, and you do not even know it." The words hit like a slap. Alaric stood motionless, his anger deflating into something raw and exposed. He had no defense. The doctor was right. Julian inclined his head. "I will take my leave now. I only came to thank her. Good day, Your Grace." He left the study, and a moment later Alaric heard his footsteps fading down the corridor. He stood alone in the dim light, his hands braced on the desk, his head bowed. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Thornfield felt the full, crushing weight of his own blindness. That night he did not retreat to his study. He went looking for her. He found her in the small garden behind the east wing, a forgotten corner of the estate where a stone bench overlooked a tangle of wild roses. She was sitting alone, her cloak wrapped around her face tilted toward the stars. She did not hear him approach until he was only a few feet away, and when she turned, her expression was guarded. "Alaric, is something wrong?" He stopped, his throat tight. "I followed you. A few nights ago, I saw you in the village." Her face went very still, the color drained from her cheeks. "You followed me." "I had to know where you were going." He took a step closer, his voice rough. "I saw what you did for that child. I saw," he paused, struggling, "I saw a woman I have never known." She rose slowly from the bench, her hands clasped in front of her. "I did not think you would care where I went." The simple truth of it cut him to the bone. He swallowed hard. "I deserve that. I have given you no reason to think I would, but I do care. I have been a fool, Alara." She watched him, her eyes luminous in the starlight, and said nothing. The silence stretched between them, full of years of loneliness and buried hope. Then a door banged somewhere in the hall, and a servant came hurrying across the lawn, breathless. "Your Grace, there's been an accident in the lower village. A cart overturned, 2 men are badly hurt. The doctor is already there, but he's asking for her Grace. He says he needs her skill." Alara's posture shifted instantly, the guardedness replaced by swift, purposeful energy. "I'll come at once." She looked at Alaric, a question in her eyes. He answered without hesitation, "I'll take you. My horse is faster." They rode together through the dark lanes, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. It was the closest they had ever been, and yet the urgency of the moment stripped away any awkwardness. When they reached the village, she leaped down and ran toward the overturned cart, where lanterns illuminated a scene of chaos and pain. Julian was already there, his sleeves rolled up, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked up in relief when he saw her. "Thank God," he breathed. "The older man has a crushed leg. I can't do it alone." Alara knelt in the mud without a moment's hesitation. She did not see the Duke standing at the edge of the lamplight, watching her with an expression of dawning agony and wonder. She worked through the night, her hands steady, her voice calm. She set the broken bones, staunched the bleeding, and soothed the terror of the injured men with words that seemed to come from a deep, bottomless well of compassion. By dawn, both men were stable, and the villagers gathered around her in a huddle of tearful gratitude. Alaric had not moved. He had stood there for hours, a silent sentinel in the shadows, and what he felt now was beyond words. It was a love so fierce and sudden that it felt like a wound. But the revelation that would shatter him completely was yet to come. As the crowd began to disperse, an old woman approached Alara, leaning heavily on a cane. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes clouded with age, but her voice was strong. "It's you," she said, peering up at the Duchess. "I wasn't sure before, but now I see it plain. You're the one who came to us 5 years ago when the fever took so many. You saved my granddaughter. You saved the Duke's own sister." Alara went rigid, her face paled. "Please," she whispered, "you are mistaken." But the old woman was insistent. "No, child, I never forget a face, even in the dark. You wore a gray cloak just like that one, and you had that same gentle way with your hands. You stayed for 3 days and nights without sleep. The little Lady Ashworth was near death, and you brought her back. I remember because I helped you change the poultices." She turned, and her gaze landed on the Duke, who had stepped forward, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. "Your Grace, this woman saved your sister's life. And she never asked for anything in return." The world tilted. Alaric felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His sister, Celia. 5 years ago, Celia had fallen gravely ill with a fever that swept through the countryside. The finest physicians had been helpless. She had been slipping away, and then inexplicably she had begun to recover. The doctors had called it a miracle. But there had been whispers of a mysterious healer, a woman in gray who had appeared and then vanished without a trace. He had searched for her. He had offered a reward. And she had never been found. He turned to Alara, and he saw the truth written in every line of her trembling body. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with unshed tears, and her hands were shaking. She had been the one. She had saved his beloved sister, and she had never told a soul. "You," he breathed, his voice cracking. "It was you." She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it for thanks. I couldn't let her die." He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that fell faster now. His own eyes were burning. "You saved my family. You saved Celia, and I married you out of duty." His voice broke. "I married you, and I treated you like a stranger. I looked through you. I let you bear this burden alone while He could not finish. The shame was too vast. Alara's lips parted, but no words came. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw not the cold, distant Duke, but a man raw with remorse and desperate love. "I have loved you too late," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers. "I have wasted so much time, but I love you, Alara." The words fell into the quiet morning like a stone into still water. The villagers, who had been watching in silent awe, began to slip away, giving them the space of the dawn. Julian Hartley, standing a little apart, looked at the two of them with a sad but gentle smile, then turned and walked away, his own quiet feelings tucked carefully into his heart. Alara's voice was a fragile thing when she spoke. "How do I know this is real? How do I know you won't go back to looking through me when the fear fades?" He drew back just enough to meet her eyes. "Because I have been blind, and now I see. Because you have shown me a strength I never possessed. Because I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving it to you if you will let me." She closed her eyes. The pain of the past months was still there, a dull ache that would take time to heal. But beneath it something new was stirring. A fragile, tentative hope, pushing through the frozen ground like a winter rose. "I don't know if I can trust this yet," she said honestly, "but I want to try." He pulled her gently into his arms, and she let him. For a long moment they simply stood there, wrapped in the gray light of morning, holding onto each other as if they had both been drowning and had finally found the shore. The healing was not instant. It came in small, quiet moments over the weeks that followed. Alaric began to walk with her to the village, insisting on carrying her satchel. He sat beside her in the cottages, his fine coat growing dusty, his hands learning to hold bandages and mix simples. The villagers, initially stunned, grew accustomed to the sight of their stern Duke kneeling on earthen floors, his voice gentle with the sick and the frightened. He was not skilled, but he was willing, and that willingness was its own kind of atonement. He told her about Celia, how his sister now lived in the south with her husband, and how she had never stopped speaking of the mysterious healer who had held her hand through the fever dreams. "She will want to meet you," he said one evening, as they walked back to the hall under a canopy of stars. "She will want to thank you properly." Alara smiled, a real smile now, one that reached her eyes. I would like that. He also made amends with Julian Hartley, in a way. He funded the young doctor's small clinic in the village and publicly acknowledged his skill. Julian accepted the gesture with grace, and when he looked at Alara, his gaze held only a gentle, respectful affection. He had loved her in his own quiet way, but he had also known that her heart was never truly available to him. Some part of her had always belonged to the cold duke who had finally learned to feel. The final piece of their reconciliation came on a crisp autumn afternoon, when Alaric led her to a wing of the hall she had never entered. He opened a door to reveal a sunlit room lined with shelves, stocked with medical texts, jars of herbs, and a long oak table perfect for preparing remedies. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the windows looked out onto the moor. "This is yours," he said, his voice uncertain. "A place for your work. I know you have your secret life in the village, but I wanted you to have something here too, a place where you don't have to hide." She walked into the room, her fingers trailing over the smooth wood of the table, her eyes filling with tears. "You built this for me." "I should have built it years ago," he said, coming to stand behind her. "I should have asked who you really were the moment you came to this house. I was too proud, too closed off. I will regret that for the rest of my life." She turned to face him, and the tears spilled over, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. "Then we will make the rest of your life different." He cupped her face in his hands, the way he had done that dawn in the village, and this time there was no hesitation. He kissed her forehead, a kiss so tender and reverent that it felt like a vow. She leaned into him, her arms sliding around his waist, and they stood there in the heart of the home that had once been a prison, but was now becoming something else entirely. The Duchess of Thornfield was invisible no longer. She walked through the halls with her head high, her satchel on her arm, her husband at her side. The servants, once distant, now smiled when she passed. The tenants spoke her name with love. And the Duke, the cold, unyielding Duke, was seen to laugh for the first time in living memory, a quiet laugh that bloomed in his chest whenever she looked at him. They were not a perfect couple. There were still shadows, still moments of old pain that would surface in the quiet hours. But they had learned to speak of them, to hold each other through them, and to build something new from the broken pieces. Love had come late, painfully late, but it had come at last, and it was stronger for the waiting. One evening, sitting together on the stone bench in the wild rose garden, Alara rested her head on his shoulder and watched the twilight deepen over the moor. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She smiled, her hand finding his. "That I used to think love was something you earned, something you had to prove yourself worthy of." She paused. "But now I think love is simply being seen, truly seen, and allowing someone to see you in return." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Then I will spend my life seeing you, Alara, every part of you, I promise." The wind whispered through the roses, and the last light of the sun turned the world to gold. In the distance, a child laughed in the village, safe and well. And in the garden of Thornfield Hall, two hearts, once so far apart, finally beat as one, wrapped in a silence that held no loneliness, only the quiet, steady rhythm of a love hard won and everlasting.